today, the title of this message is Godliness. It all starts with the fear of God. It all starts with the fear of God. Now, last week I pointed out that if we're going to be godly Christians, and I hope that is the desire of your heart, to be a godly man or a godly woman, a godly teenager, or maybe a godly boy or a godly girl. If we are going to be godly people, we have to be devoted to God. I was excited and very encouraged last week to see so many of you come and make that spiritual decision here at the altar that you wanted to be completely and fully devoted to God. May we never forget that nobody, listen to me, nobody has ever become godly without being completely devoted to God. If we're going to be godly people, then we have to be completely devoted to our great and awesome God. And the reason why I say that is because apart from God, there is no such thing as godliness. Godliness is a byproduct of a God-centered life. Would you describe your life as being God-centered? Or maybe you yourself are at the center of your life. If so, you have a man-centered view or perspective of life. And when life is all about you, it won't work the way God designed for it to work. Our life is to be God-centered. And when we're focused on God, when God is supreme and prominently in the lordship spot in our life, then we know that we will be devoted to God, and the byproduct of that will be godliness. So, what does it mean to be devoted to God? I want us to think about answering that question over the next few weeks, because Jerry Bridges, in his book entitled Practicing Godliness, The Practice of Godliness, he says that being devoted to God involves three elements, three key elements. Number one, the fear of God. Number two, the love of God. And then number three, the desire for God. Let me repeat that. There are three key elements if we are going to be devoted to God. Number one, the fear of God. Number two, the love of God. And then number three, the desire for God. Now this morning, we're just going to think about the first key element to being devoted to God, and that is the fear of God. Years ago, and some of you are going to have to go back in your minds a little bit, but years ago you would often hear the expression, "He is a God-fearing man." How many of you remember hearing an expression like that? Sure we do. He is a God-fearing man. Or maybe we said, she is a God-fearing woman. We don't hear that expression quite as much anymore. Maybe it's because we think that the fear of God as being something old-fashioned, or maybe we have even convinced ourselves that the fear of God is something that is a concept in the Old Testament, but it really doesn't really apply to us today. By the way, there's no question that in the Old Testament, the fear of God is extensively dealt with, but as we will see today, it is also a New Testament concept. One thing is for sure, and that is that the fear of God has certainly disappeared from our culture today. A verse that best describes 21st century American culture is this, and I believe it's Romans chapter 3 and verse 18. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Would you not agree with me that that really summarizes the American culture in which we live today? The fear of God has vanished. There is no fear of God before their eyes. I believe that you would agree with me that we have lost the fear of God in our country. And I'll tell you why I say that, because we as the United States of America have condoned that which God has clearly condemned in His Word. Nowhere do we see that more than in the lack of morality that exists in America today. Over the last half a century, over the last 50 years, we have literally seen the moral disintegration of what was once the greatest country in the world. Amen. Believe it or not, there was a day and time when, as America, we had a healthy fear of God. Right. How many of you remember that day and time? There was a healthy fear of God. Even those who did not profess to be Christians, even those who did not go to church on a weekly basis, there was a healthy fear of God. How many of you still see that phrase on our currency, our monetary currency, under God? Do you occasionally glance at maybe a coin or look at a paper bill and see there's a movement today where they're trying to remove that? I believe we ought to keep it right there. Amen? Under God. But there was a day and time in the history of the United States when those two words, under God, they were more than just a statement that was printed on our monetary currency. It expressed a way of thinking. It expressed our way of life as a country. Amen. The phrase under God says a couple of things to me. Number one, it says that there was a day and time when we as a nation believed in God. Not gods, but God. Amen. Right? It doesn't say under gods, little g, O-D-S. It says under, capital G-O-D, under God. In other words, we were not an atheistic nation, and we were not a polytheistic nation. Now today, atheism is growing in the United States of America. Polytheism, where the belief in the multiplicity of God seems to be a dominant way of thinking in our culture today. I want you to know there was a day and time when we were not atheistic and we were not polytheistic because of those two words, under God. Secondly, those two words, under God, say to me that we did not view ourselves above God or equal to God, but rather under God. Amen. Somewhere along the way, the fear of God disappeared in our nation. I believe I can safely say that a fearless culture will eventually become a godless culture. Right? We have seen that. Many of you have lived it. You've seen it happen in the United States of America. This country that we love dearly. We have seen the fear of God completely disappear, and today we have a godless culture that exists. Hope for America begins with the fear of God.